and whose insights are especially important in moments like this. Dr. Susan Collins is President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and in that role, she serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, the body responsible for setting U.S. monetary policy and guiding the nation through periods of economic uncertainty and opportunity. What makes President Collins' leadership so valuable is the rare combination of experience she brings to the table. She's not only a policymaker at the highest level, she's also a very distinguished macroeconomist with decades of academic and research experience focused on how economies grow, adapt, and remain resilient. She has held senior leadership roles at Harvard, Georgetown, the University of Michigan, and the Brookings Institution, and she holds degrees in economics from Harvard and MIT. That blend of rigorous scholarship and practical policymaking gives her a unique perspective, one that is deeply informed by data, but also grounded in the real-world experiences of workers, employers, and communities across New England. Here in Western Massachusetts, we also appreciate that the Boston Fed, under President Collins' leadership, is actively engaged with regional voices, listening to businesses, to educators, labor leaders, and nonprofits to understand how national economic trends show up locally. On a personal note, our CEO, Roger Crandall, recently concluded several years of service on the Boston Fed's board of directors, including a term as board president. His experience reinforced the seriousness of independence and public service mission that defined the Federal Reserve and the thoughtful, collaborative leadership that President Collins brings to her role. Today, we are very fortunate to hear directly from someone who sits at the center of conversations shaping inflation, employment, financial stability, and long-term economic growth, and who understands how those issues affect regions like ours. We're truly grateful to have her out here in Springfield today. Thank you again for this huge crowd to show up to listen to her. And please join me in giving a huge Springfield welcome to the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Dr. Susan Collins.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say it is wonderful to see all of you and to be here with you today. And I have to say it's also just a huge honor to be on the program with Governor Healy, Secretary Paley, Congressman Neal, and Mayor Sarno. So just really wonderful to be here with you. Thank you for all of the work that you do to support the vibrancy of Western Michigan and the economy more broadly. So, you know, all of you are actively engaged in building not only the present, but also the future economy in Western Massachusetts. And so in that context, I'd particularly like to thank Diana Seinel and Dominic Iano as well for the invitation to be here. It's really, again, a pleasure, and appreciate all of the collaborative work, and that is going to be one of my themes that is just in such evidence here and across the engagements. So today what I'd like to do first, for context, is to share just a bit about the Federal Reserve, and then I'm going to discuss the economy, my outlook, and the implications for my views about appropriate monetary policy. And then I'll end with some perspectives on small businesses. And, you know, along the way, I am going to share some numbers because objective rigor is just always important. It's central for what we do. But again, I will also note some qualitative themes. The two go hand in hand, and those relate to some of the many things that I hear when I'm meeting with people across Massachusetts and across New England. But first, before I jump in, I do need to give my standard disclaimer. These comments reflect my own views and not necessarily those of my colleagues at the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., or at other Federal Reserve banks. So in my job, it's really vital to complement the data that we receive with outreach to people on the front lines, participants in the economy. And that's in all kinds of places. I mean rural, urban, suburban. And I also mean not only places that are thriving, also places that are struggling. And so I spend time hearing about economic opportunities, but also about the challenges. experiences with costs and prices, the job market, reflecting the Federal Reserve's congressionally mandated goals, which are price stability and maximum employment. 8 times a year, I gather with other Federal Reserve officials as part of the Federal Open Market Committee, or fondly known as the FOMC, to deliberate on interest rates, sharing our analysis and our insights, and using that to determine what we see as an appropriate stance for monetary policy. And while this certainly is not the Fed's only role, it is a very important one. We also provide vital payment services and platforms which underpin the financial system, ensure safety, soundness, and fair access to credit by supervising many financial institutions, and we do rigorous research on a wide variety of economic issues and work to serve as a resource more broadly for our district, which is most of New England. All of our work supports a vision of a vibrant economy that works for everyone, not just for some people, and also a resilient financial system. The value that policymakers get from listening to stakeholders in their districts underlines the wisdom of the U.S. central bank's framing more than 112 years ago as a federated system with components that are spread throughout the country, not just in the nation's capital and the financial capital, New York City. The federated structure befits our expansive and really varied country that's filled with such a range of people, industries, and places. And that's one of the many reasons I'm excited that today I'm able to learn more about the energy grid, and that was in Holyoke, to meet with members of the Western Massachusetts Economic Development Council, and then later today I'll be seeing some of the aspects of Massachusetts' agricultural economy in Greenfield and holding a roundtable about the rural economy. And all of that helps to complement the statistical data and information that I use to understand economic conditions and develop an outlook. So a final but important introductory point before I turn to economic conditions and then small business. Springfield, where we're gathering here today, has long been really important to the Boston Fed, and I just want to spend a moment on that. You've had a major impact on the ways that we work with communities across the district. Like so many mid-sized cities, Springfield experienced the decline in U.S. manufacturing over the decades. And with our focus on the public's economic well-being, the Boston Fed began in the mid-2000s analyzing economic development approaches of mid-sized manufacturing-oriented cities like Springfield during the prior half of the century. And the idea, again, is analytic rigor, to learn from information and then to be able to build on it. We found that for most resurgent small cities, the ones that actually were turning around and moving towards thriving, industry mix, demographic composition, and geographical position, those were not the key factors. Instead, the most important lessons from the resurgent cities are collaborations among numerous organizations and sectors, and that's a topic that has already been spoken to by my predecessors on the podium. Building on the insight that cross-sector collaboration on shared goals was what we now think of as the secret sauce in the most resurgent cities, the Boston Fed, under my predecessor, Eric Rosengren, developed programs to help spark and support that cross-sector collaboration, first in smaller cities and then also in rural areas. The solutions are local ideas, developed and refined by local people from a wide range of sectors. For example, the Springfield Working Places effort, called Springfield Works, included more than 40 partners involved in workforce development and identified ways to address employment barriers and create career ladders, even across firms, again, collaboration. So residents can locate job openings and advance in them, and employers can hire and retain the workers they need. In nearby Holyoke, the effort focused on strengthening the overall business ecosystem with a variety of partners collaborating to nurture entrepreneurship and to tackle barriers to business development. Ultimately, the Boston Fed's Working Places programs engaged in 30 sites across 5 states, and we continue to draw lessons from those collective efforts. So while many of the challenges in places seeking resurgence are the purview of fiscal policymakers, the Boston Fed's commitment to a vibrant economy that works for all leads us to contribute as objective researchers and at times as conveners. There are no shortages of challenges, but there are many opportunities as well. And the keys for all of us who care about the New England economy are engagement, cross-sector collaboration, objective analysis, and a shared commitment to progress. So with that as introduction and context, let me turn to the national economy and monetary policy, and then I will conclude with some comments about recent trends involving small businesses and their vital importance, as you all know, to New England. So, turning to the national economy, and in keeping with the themes for this forum, I want to briefly discuss economic performance last year, implications for the outlook this year, and my views on monetary policy. And I'll focus first on growth overall, then the labor market, and then inflation. And I should mention that my focus for this part will be the national economy, and of course the aggregate data does mask considerable difference across different geographies and different places, and my focus is going to be national. So starting with economic activity, Starting with economic activity, real GDP in 2025 was stronger than many had expected, especially when considering the unanticipated changes in tariffs and immigration policies, and also the extended government shutdown. Figure 1, this figure shows that despite these headwinds, the economy grew at 2.2%. That's only a bit slower than it grew in 2024, and it's near my estimate of GDP growth when the economy is operating at its full capacity. Consumer spending, which is the largest component of aggregate expenditure, was an important contributor to sustaining growth in 2025. And this reflected still favorable consumption growth, as well as elevated household net worth, with continued increases in equity and housing valuations likely accounting for about a third of the growth in household spending. But I do want to note that, again, the aggregate data mask a range of experiences across geographies and also across demographic groups. And in particular, I continue to hear about financial strains among lower income households and how these strains are affecting their spending. Business spending on both research and development and equipment, which is a notable portion of which, but certainly not all, is AI related, also helped to bolster demand last year. At the same time, the strength in investment and consumption was offset to some degree by a contraction in investment in housing, and housing, of course, is top of mind as we think about growth and development, and also in business structures other than AI data centers. So despite this solid economic growth, the labor market conditions softened in 2025. And Figure 2 shows that job growth was well below the pace in recent years. In this chart, the gray vertical bars denote periods of recession. And I'll note that labor supply growth, and thus the break-even rate for payroll gains, does change over time. Despite the still it appears that the rate of hiring last year was below break-even, as we saw a modest increase in the unemployment rate, as seen in Figure 3. And while I do not put too much emphasis on particular data points, at 4.4% in February, and we just received jobs data for February this morning, the unemployment rate remains relatively low by historical standards, and it has been relatively stable as well over the past few months. So I want to make 3 points about this context. First, firms' hesitancy to hire, the low hire but also low fire environment, likely reflected both the highly uncertain economic environment due to changing tariff policies and also the potentially reduced need for workers due to productivity gains, including advances in AI. But while noteworthy, developments potentially related to AI adoption appear to have been contained, at least so far. A second point is that last year's labor market softening reflected reduced growth in both labor demand and in labor supply, and those are difficult to disentangle. But the sharp immigration slowdown implies that a slower net pace of job creation is now needed in order to keep the labor market relatively balanced. And so, we saw the unemployment rate remaining relatively balanced, even though the job gains, the job growth overall had slowed. But I will say that the balance is a somewhat unusual balance, and there are many dimensions to remain attentive to. Third point is solid growth with little job creation implies that 2025 was another good year for labor productivity. In fact, output per hour worked has been growing notably faster since the COVID-19 pandemic compared with the average between 2008 and 2019. And in my travels around the district, I hear just numerous examples of efficiency gains, and most of them are not AI related. Things like automation, streamlined business processes. And as I'll discuss, this strong productivity growth has important implications for thinking about how economic conditions might evolve. So even with activity growing near capacity and little inflationary pressures from the labor market, inflation has remained elevated. And the left-hand panel in this figure shows that core PCE inflation, which is an informative measure that the Fed tracks closely, that excludes the important but volatile food and energy categories, was 3% on a 12-month basis in December 2025. Now, while that's down from the earlier peak, that's the same as it was in December 2024, and it's still a full percentage point above the FOMC's 2% inflation target. As shown in the right-hand panel, 5 years of high rates of inflation have resulted in a surge in the price level, and that is something that I hear about frequently in conversations around New England. Returning the inflation rate to target will not, of course, reduce the price level, but it is essential for restoring the steady, predictable pricing environment that's conducive to a vibrant economy that works for everyone. The lack of progress on inflation reflects different dynamics across different categories, and that is shown in Figure 5. Goods price inflation in panel A moved up noticeably, and that is primarily due to tariffs. In contrast, shelter price inflation, which is importantly driven by changes in rents, is back down to levels that were typical pre-pandemic, and that's shown in panel B. However, panel C shows that there was little improvement in services inflation, excluding shelter, and that is the largest of these three components. So I'll now turn to how economic developments from last year inform my outlook for 2026. And though there's considerable economic uncertainty still exacerbated by recent geopolitical developments like the hostilities in the Middle East, my baseline outlook remains fairly benign. It continues to feature solid economic growth, relatively balanced labor market conditions, and disinflation resuming later this year as tariff effects fade. And I'd like to say a little bit more about each of those. So starting with real activity, there are a few reasons to expect continued solid growth. Broad financial conditions remain supportive of economic growth, especially given the FOMC's cumulative policy rate cuts late last year, totaling 0.75 percentage point. And for households, tax cuts should increase disposable income and consumers' ability to spend. Business spending is likely to be bolstered by increased investment incentives, while robust AI-related data center expenditures continue. And the drag from reduced investment in housing and non-AI business structures seems likely to diminish. This more broad-based growth should also provide some insurance against the possibility of more limited gains in household net worth and the resulting support to consumption going forward. With respect to the labor market, past productivity expansions suggest that hiring tends to pick up after an initial period of limited job growth, and that happens as more firms enter the market to take advantage of gains from productivity improvements. But the path of job gains, and this again comes from looking at historical examples, depends on the extent to which the new technology complements or displaces labor. And it's really still too early to know the impact of recent and ongoing productivity gains. But relative to average historical patterns, I see the potential for somewhat more labor replacement, possibly unfolding more quickly in the past, but again, complemented by, and even if there are labor-enhancing effects as well, and I hear about both sets of those in my discussions around the district. So overall, while I expect hiring to pick up relative to last year's sluggish pace, it seems likely to remain modest. Finally, regarding inflation, while I expect tariff-driven increases in goods prices to wane later last year, other scenarios are also plausible, and I've mentioned that, of course, considerable uncertainty remains. If the enacted tariff rates rise again after the current temporary 10% global tariff expires in July, we could see additional tariff-related price increases. More broadly, an important issue for the inflation outlook is the extent to which firms will pass those productivity gains through to consumer prices, limiting upward pressure on inflation from that solid demand. And this is most likely to occur if there's price competition, as more firms adopt the new technologies and new firms enter into profitable markets. But this is a process that can take time. And as a result, my outlook has demand exerting some upward pressure on prices, slowing the return of inflation to 2%. So monetary policy should be based on an assessment of where the economy is going. And so based on my outlook, I see a patient, deliberate approach to monetary policy as appropriate. Again, my baseline outlook features a still uncertain inflation picture with continued upside risks, combined with recent evidence suggesting a labor market that continues to be relatively balanced. And in my view, this argues for maintaining policy rates at their current mildly restrictive levels, likely for some time. I do not see an urgency for additional policy adjustments, and I'll be looking for clear evidence that inflation is moving durably towards the 2% target, and that's something that might occur only in the second half of the year. Of course, it remains very important to continue assessing the incoming data in their entirety, looking holistically at the information. And I see policy as well positioned to adjust as needed, depending on how conditions and the outlook evolve. So I'd like to turn now to small businesses for the last part of my remarks. So I really don't need to tell all of you that just how important small business is for economic vibrancy, especially here in New England. They contribute to job creation, to innovation, and to engagement and connections in so many different ways. So as Figure 6 shows, businesses with less than 100 employees nationally accounted for about a third of total employment. And these are data from 2023, which is the most recent year we can break total employment by firm size down both nationally and locally. So moreover, the so-called micro enterprises, and those are the ones that have 1 to 19 employees, provide 1 out of every 6 jobs. More generally, smaller business with fewer than 250 workers accounted for about 55% of net new job creation between 2013 and 2023. So they are playing a key role, and I think it's important that we more broadly recognize that. The importance of small business is even more apparent when measured as a share of all companies in the United States. In fact, more than 70% of all businesses are headed by sole proprietors, while micro enterprises account for nearly 85% of firms that have any employees at all. So again, just speaks to the importance that they play in our economy. So turning to New England, the share of jobs in micro enterprises is well above the national average. And this figure really highlights that, where it shows that the counties with shares of micro businesses above the national average are the ones that are shaded in blue, and the darker blue means that that share is even larger. So while this is particularly true for northern New England, it's also evident in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And in fact, in 14 of New England's 68 counties, micro enterprises provide 30% or more of all jobs. And I do want to note that counties that contain a larger city tend to have smaller shares of micro enterprises. That's true for Suffolk County, which includes Boston, and for Hampden County, where we are right now, that of course includes Springfield. The critical importance of small and micro businesses has been a theme in so many of the areas that I have visited across New England. It is an important, constant topic, and again, an important one. And that certainly includes rural communities that are contending with the loss of large employers, for example, Millinocket, Maine. But it's also been a theme in areas where smaller firms are essential to the supply chain for larger firms. And so the small firms, again, are part of that ecosystem in a wide range of important ways. And just as an example of that last one, small manufacturers in Connecticut and Rhode Island are essential to the supply chain for electric boat. Despite their economic importance, we don't actually have a lot of data, especially on a timely basis, about small businesses. And this is one of the many reasons that I spend time traveling and talking to people who are actively participating in the economy to understand their experiences, challenges, and perspectives. One timely source of data we have is monthly survey data gathered by the National Federation of Independent Businesses, or NFIB. That represents a wide range of small and independent businesses of various sizes across different industries. Given my focus on inflation and the labor market, I'd like to highlight a few related trends recently that come from the NFIB survey. And I'll augment this information with just a little of what I've heard in discussions with small businesses around New England. So in terms of price pressures, Figure 8 shows that the percentage of respondents in the NFIB survey who cite inflation as a single most important problem they face in a given month, and that figure highlights that while these concerns have certainly eased, they're certainly down from the peaks a couple of years ago, they remain notably elevated relative to historical norms. And I hear a great deal about that anecdotally, about the cost concerns that small businesses have. Many report large increases in health insurance benefits costs, for example. At a recent meeting with a dozen small businesses, almost all of them mentioned that their cost pressures were rising, which in most cases are pushing them to reduce margins given a strongly competitive environment. Several noted reduced capital investment as a result. And we hear many accounts of rising costs for energy, construction, packaging, inputs. And an issue mentioned in almost every conversation is high housing costs, which I mentioned earlier. And those housing costs affect labor availability and the ability to hire and retain workers. At the same time, the NFIB survey finds that a shrinking share of small and independent businesses report having open positions that they're unable to fill. And again, that concern also did peak, as you can see in the chart. This pattern is consistent with the overall labor market softening, as I discussed earlier, that we've seen at the national level, where conditions are relatively balanced, even if in a somewhat unusual way, and they're generating limited wage inflationary pressures. But even so, it remains challenging for many businesses around the region to fill highly skilled positions. And this has led some companies to focus more on workforce development programs, including providing further training to existing employees. And those collaborative initiatives can be extremely beneficial for developing those pipelines. Despite these challenges, I also hear about the positives for small businesses, especially around innovation, adaptation, and vibrancy, not to mention just some fabulous examples of collaboration and creativity. So figure 10 shows some of the small business visits that I have had the privilege of being able to make in recent months. And I've seen small businesses identifying areas where skills gaps exist and then designing programs with local partners to train workers in a win-win-win situation. And a great example there is Cape Air and Plymouth Airport working with Cape Cod Community College and other partners on aerospace mechanic training. I've seen smaller companies that are challenged to do large-scale workforce training collaborate with each other and the public sector to create manufacturing skills pipelines. And I've seen innovative startups solving problems and building new businesses on the region's legacy strengths. For example, a company aiming to solve the modern problem of plastic waste by leveraging Maine's legacy of pulp and paper using molded fiber packaging as a replacement for single-use plastic. So the examples are extensive, and I did also want to include some from around the broader district, although, of course, my visits here in Massachusetts have been so insightful and valuable as well. So the theme of today's gathering is, of course, the outlook for 2026 and beyond. And I hope that sharing my assessment of the economy and the implications of that assessment, that outlook for monetary policy, provides a helpful context for you. So while there are certainly many uncertainties and challenges in the national economic outlook, I, again, hope I've conveyed my tremendous optimism for New England. And that optimism is rooted in meeting so many dynamic, creative, dedicated, effective people who are working on the front lines of the economy to leverage the skills and the character of New England's people, the vibrancy of our unique ecosystem of institutions and companies, and the benefits, again, of collaboration and innovation. So in that spirit, I'd like to end where I started, saying just what a huge pleasure it is to be with all of you this afternoon who are building the Western Massachusetts economy. And I wish you all the best as those efforts continue throughout 2026. Thank you so much.